James Swallow documents the experiment in Nemesis, the 13th novel in the Horus Heresy series, and there is nothing else in 40,000 years of canonical history that looks like it. The subject is a former operative of Clade Culexus, born a human untouchable, seized by the Silent Sisterhood, subjected to further augmentation and experimentation to make him a more powerful operative, and then eventually scheduled for execution when his usefulness to the Imperium was deemed exhausted. He was a blank, a pariah, a human being whose genetic mutation produced a negative warp presence so absolute that no soul signature existed for any warp entity to sense, locate, or enter. The Immaterium, from his perspective, simply wasn't there, and from the Immaterium's perspective, neither was he. Erebus, first chaplain of the Word-bearers, acquired him before the execution was carried out.
The ritual that followed is documented as chaotic rituals and blood rites, and its objective was to force a minor daemon from the Immaterium directly into the pariah's flesh. Not through possession. Possession requires warp soul channels, channels this man didn't have, channels whose absence was the entire definition of what he was. Through blood, through material binding, through a ritual that didn't ask the warp soul interface to cooperate because there was no warp soul interface to ask. The ritual worked. The daemon didn't leave. The null aura didn't cancel it. The daemon stayed, active, stable, reshaping the subject's biology across the months of his deployment into something a blog review describes as the shape-shifting, demon-skin-wearing entity who would operate under the code name Spear, a counterpsyker, a being capable of redirecting psychic attacks back at their source if he could first obtain a blood sample from the target to synchronize the weapon's attunement.
He wore the demon like armor grown from inside. His null field held it in place. The demon couldn't get out. In a comment section on a video on this channel, one person identified the core contradiction in a single sentence. One like. To be fair, Erebus created the Black Pariah, which was a blank with a demon skin. Those things shouldn't be compatible. They are correct. By every mechanical specification the setting provides for both entities, the experiment should have been impossible. A pariah's null aura is the active absence of warp presence. A demon is pure warp presence. They are the architectural antithesis of each other. The ritual should have destroyed one of them, or both. It held. Which means the architecture that made it possible was already somewhere in the canon, waiting to be named. The strongest available reading of the evidence points to that architecture having been used once before, not at the scale of a single assassin, but at the scale of a Primarch.
Not as an improvised weapon for an unsanctioned assassination attempt, but as a deliberate design specification for an operation that required a being who could carry a demon inside him, into the Immaterium, and not be consumed. No Games Workshop source confirms this. No Black Library text designates Subject 11 as a null demon hybrid. The argument is forensic, working backward from a documented canonical anomaly to reconstruct the blueprint the anomaly implies. Spear is the receipt. Subject 11 is the question the receipt raises about what was being built at full scale. That is the methodology. The evidence follows. The boy who became Erebus strangled a more accomplished child with a garrote, replicated the dead boy's facial tattoos precisely, and stole his name. The Lexicanum records this as biographical background without elaboration.
It's the most compressed possible statement of his nature. Achievement as material to be taken, patience as the primary weapon, identity as whatever serves the current objective. By the heresy, he held the position of first chaplain, the figure responsible for codifying the word-bearer's chaos doctrine, translating 50 to 100 years of accumulated Eye of Terror experience into operational ritual practice. He personally corrupted Lorgar, converting his Primarch's theological grief into full service of the ruinous powers. He corrupted Horus, staging the wound at Davin, orchestrating the Serpent Lodge ritual, projecting himself into the War Master's feverish unconscious and showing him futures calibrated specifically to the Primarch's existing vanities. He stole the Kinnebrak anatheme from the Interex's Hall of Weapons, precipitating the war that ended that civilization and producing the blade used to wound Horus.
He built the Ruin Storm after Calth, the warp storm that split the Imperium in two and isolated the Loyalist relief fleets from Terra for the duration of the heresy. In Betrayer, Aaron Dembski-Bowden shows him killing Argel Tal, the commander of the Gal Vorbak, because Erebus had calculated that Tal's friendship with Karn would eventually prevent Karn from achieving his destiny as the Blessed of Khorne. He murdered one of the heresy's most powerful chaos warriors based on probabilistic calculations about a future event. His own statement, preserved in the Lexicanum. And for all of this, I am hated. For being there at the outset, for laying the foundations that others would willingly build on. I think they wish to find something in this story that explains things, some moment of decision, some choice that could later be regretted or accounted for. But it's just as I said, none. This isn't a man who improvises. He moves toward conclusions he has already decided are inevitable, using whatever path presents itself. When he designed the ritual for Spear, he wasn't experimenting in the scientific sense. He had calculated that the result would be functional and that the resulting weapon could kill the Emperor, and that killing the Emperor was the correct tactical move regardless of Horus's explicit claim to that right. He was wrong about the strategy. Horus responded to learning of the unauthorized assassination attempt by flaying the heavily tattooed flesh from Erebus's skull with his own athame. The technical calculation, though, the ritual itself, was sound. The daemon held. The pariah functioned. The experiment was the one thing in Erebus's heresy-era portfolio that worked precisely as designed and produced no negative consequence for its creator beyond Horus's fury at the strategic implication. The word-bearer's daemon-binding knowledge by the time of the heresy was systematic and deep. The Gal Vorbak were themselves a successful fusion. Astartes, who had survived the integration of warp entities into their physical bodies, producing the possessed warriors that the first heretic traces through their creation and deployment. The Legion had received chaos-derived revelations about Lorgar's own origins, with entities claiming direct knowledge of his creation. I will show you how your Primarch was born. I will show you why the Cadians called him the favored son of the Four. The Emperor isn't his only father. Their ritual knowledge extended into the mechanics of Primarch-level design. When Erebus pushed that accumulated expertise toward the question of whether a null host could contain a demon, rather than host one conventionally or repel one conventionally, he was pushing the boundaries of what the entire tradition of chaos practice had attempted. No chaos sorcerer before him had apparently tried this. The experiment was a logical extension of the program, not an accident. The canonical mechanics of the Pariah need to be established with precision before the resolution can carry weight, because the impossibility must be felt before the reframe matters. The Warhammer 40K fandom wiki's entry on blanks opens with the mechanical definition. A blank, also known an untouchable, a psychic null, and a pariah, is a human who possesses the rare mutation sometimes inaccurately described as the pariah gene that makes them generate no psychic presence in the Immaterium, thus leaving them essentially soulless. No presence, not reduced presence, not partial, zero. And for true pariahs, those in whom the mutation is dominant rather than recessive, the effect is active, not merely passive.
The wiki continues. The minds of blanks can actually somehow sever the connection between the warp and real space within their local area. Every psyker within range finds their abilities weakened or non-functional. The blank is immune to all direct psychic effects. Demons, beings constituted entirely of warp energy, find the blank's proximity painful, even to the point that they will be driven back into the Immaterium simply to escape their presence. The institutional endpoint of this mutation is the Culexus assassin. Their primary weapon, the animus speculum, functions not by attacking through the warp, but by draining the psychic energy present in the surrounding environment and channeling it as directed blasts. The Lexicanum notes the device dampens the Culexus's own negative psychic aura, preventing it from affecting nearby allies. That is active modulation, the null field being managed and channeled, not simply radiating passively. The secondary device, the Immaterium, converts nullified warp energy into a concealment field, rendering the Culexus effectively invisible to psychic detection. The null energy isn't destroyed, it's transformed, redirected, made into something functional. A null field that can be modulated and repurposed is mechanically different from one that simply cancels everything in proximity. At the burning of Prospero, documented in the Lexicanum from the relevant Horus Heresy sources, the Sisters of Silence entered the battle line and changed the character of the engagement immediately. The Lexicanum's description is precise. They moved through the defensive line in small groups or as individuals, their bizarre nature immediately dampening or nullifying the psychic powers of the defenders. Thousand Suns Marines who had been holding their own against space wolves, using psychic abilities that had earlier incinerated space wolf squads and sustained a telekinetic kind shield against orbital bombardment, found themselves suddenly unable to access the warp at all. The sisters didn't attack them psychically. They simply existed nearby and the warp went silent around them. The Lexicanum records that the Thousand Suns' only effective response was to concentrate physical firepower on the sisters themselves. Warp-based attacks simply couldn't reach them. Across multiple source texts, descriptions of null mechanics use two distinct sets of verbs that aren't actually equivalent. Repel, cancel, drive back, nullify. These describe the exclusion model, where the null field pushes warp energy away. But other descriptions use siphon, absorb, drain, draw inward, like light into a black hole. A black hole doesn't repel light that crosses the event horizon. It contains it. Nothing escapes from inside. The exclusion model and the absorption model produce different architectural conclusions about what happens when a warp entity encounters a null field from inside rather than from outside. The distinction between warp immunity and physical immunity is the mechanical key. The fandom wiki entry states it directly. Blanks are completely immune to demonic possession and spiritual corruption, but they remain vulnerable to the physical shell of a daemon. A daemon's material manifestation, the flesh and bone it constructs from warp stuff to exist in real space, can still injure a blank through physical impact.
Warp immunity and physical immunity are separate properties.
A demon that has been bonded through blood rights to a blank's physical body isn't entering through warp soul channels, because those channels don't exist. It's bound to the physical substrate itself. The null field suppresses the demon's warp aspect, but the physical bonding isn't a warp-soul interaction. It's material. When the null field closes around something that's now physically inside it, bound by ritual to flesh, the demon's warp aspect is suppressed, and its warp exit routes are sealed. It can't possess the host in any conventional sense. It can't project through the null field back into the Immaterium. The null field isn't canceling the demon. The null field is the cage. No canonical text uses that word. The inference assembles from 3 documented data points. The word trapped in the fandom wiki's description of Spear. The daemon is, in a way, trapped within his flesh. Not possessing, not merging with, trapped. The absorption and siphon vocabulary in multiple descriptions of how null auras mechanically operate, and the Culexus animus speculum as the documented precedent for null energy being modular, channelable, and convertible rather than simply canceling everything it encounters. The vault mechanic is the forensic conclusion from the available evidence. It isn't a citation from any source text. One detail matters for the scale constraint. Erebus deliberately used a minor daemon. A more powerful warp entity might have been able to force its way through the null containment. The stability of the architecture appears to be scale-dependent. Minor daemon, stable vault. Below a sufficient threshold of warp intensity, the cage holds. Spear became a counter-psyker because the ritual found the specific condition under which a null field and a warp entity can coexist. Physical bonding instead of warp soul entry. Absorption rather than exclusion. The null field as container rather than canceller. Erebus built this weapon, deployed it, and when it was destroyed on Dagonet by Malkador's Imperial execution force, he moved on. He never returned to the architecture. He never needed to. He had built it to kill the Emperor. The Emperor wasn't dead, and Horus had made clear that the assassination attempt had been an error in strategic judgment. The architecture lay dormant in the record of Nemesis. What the canonical record preserves about the 11th Primarch is sparse. The shape of it, assembled in sequence, is consistent enough to be read. Primarch 11 existed. Found in the year 927 M30 and reunited with his legion. Chambers built for him at the Imperial Palace, the same chambers constructed for all 20.
He met Alpharius before the heresy, which narrows the window of his active period. His records are designated in imperial listings as expunged. The Lexicanum's article on the 2 unknown legions calls it the most successful edict of obliteration ever carried out in imperial history. The distinction matters. The traitor legions remain in the record, listed and condemned as excommunicate traitorous. Legions 2 and 11 are simply gone, not condemned, erased. Rogel Dorn, standing in the investiary in Dan Abnett's short story The Lightning Tower, looks at the 2 empty plinths that once held statues. The 2nd and 11th plinths had been vacant for a long time. No one ever spoke of those 2 absent brothers. Their separate tragedies had seemed like aberrations. Had they, in fact, been warnings that no one had heeded? The word he uses is tragedies, not betrayals. The emotional register is grief, not condemnation. In The First Heretic by Aaron Dembski Bowden, during a vision sequence involving the Gal Vorbak, the 11th Primarch is referenced at the moment before the scattering, described as still innocent and pure, untouched by whatever came later. One member of the Gal Vorbak suggests killing the 11th in infancy would save them a lot of trouble. Argel Tal observes that killing the 11th in his infancy would unwrite a shameful future. The descriptor is shameful, not dangerous, not threatening in the way a warp-corrupted asset would be threatening. The Gal Vorbak aren't worried about being hurt by him. They're worried about something that will be, in retrospect, a source of shame. That word suggests a design choice, something the Emperor decided to do that a future perspective would judge, rather than a failure or a betrayal. In 1,000 Suns by Graham McNeill, Magnus begins referencing a gathering that had included the lost Primarchs.
Mortarion cuts him off immediately. And the Emperor forbade us to speak of it again. Do you disobey that command? The Emperor personally issued the prohibition, not Malcador, not the Council of Terra. The Emperor, who at the time of 1,000 Suns was still directing the Great Crusade directly, made the two absent Primarchs a matter he controlled personally. The surviving brothers swore an oath, documented in the Lexicanum summary of the first heretic, not to speak of the lost ones at all. In False Gods by Graham McNeill, Chaos orchestrates a vision for the unconscious Horus, walking him through the Genovault where the Primarchs were gestated. Horus moves through the chamber until he stops at Tank 11. The text records his awareness of untapped glories that lay within, knowing they would never come to pass. He stands there, before a tank that represents a Primarch already gone by the time of the heresy, and then he smashes his fist against it in a surge of emotion, damaging the container. The Chaos powers chose to show him that specific vat. They extracted grief and rage from the War Master about the number 11 specifically. If Subject 11 had simply been a traitor or a failure, there would be no grief to extract from Horus about him. The Chaos vision exploited an existing wound, not an existing anger. In Deliverance Lost by Gav Thorpe, Corax asks the Emperor why he's numbered the 19th Primarch, but there are only 17 others. The Emperor's expression becomes bleak, filled with deep sorrow. His response, "The other two, that is a conversation for another day." A being who planned the reunification of humanity across millennia reacts to a simple, numerical question about two of his sons with sorrow. The 9th edition Custodes Codex contains the short story Chamber at the End of Memory, in which Rogel Dorn, after Malcador removes his memory blocks about the missing Primarchs, finds their tombs beneath the Imperial Palace. The Codex entry for what Dorn discovers isn't designated as Primarch 11. It's classified as Subject 11. Whatever is in that tomb has been reclassified in the records Malcador keeps. Not a fallen Primarch, a subject, a thing that requires separate designation from the standard Primarch classification. In Prospero Burns by Dan Abnett, Lehman Russ is asked whether it's unprecedented for Space Marines to fight Space Marines. His response, precisely rendered in the Lexicanum, is, "That?" he answers. He laughs, but it's a sad sound. Hjolda, no, that's not unprecedented. The Space Wolves had sanctioned another legion before, and the context of Prospero Burns and the Lexicanum's collection of references makes clear this was before the heresy formally began. No data point names him, none describes his abilities. What remains is the shape of what was taken, the Emperor's personal prohibition and personal grief, the surviving Primarch's sworn oath of silence, the tragedies rather than the betrayals, the shameful future rather than the threatening one, the separate classification as a subject rather than a Primarch,
the tombs beneath the palace rather than condemned homeworlds. The redaction is more thorough than anything done to the traitor legions. The emotional register surrounding it's entirely different.
The shape of the hole in the record is consistent with a being whose existence was both too dangerous to acknowledge and too painful for the Emperor to speak of without sorrow. Magnus is the documented reference point for what Primarch-scale amplification of a trait looks like in operational terms. Individual psychers can influence minds, manipulate matter, perceive probable futures. Magnus, operating at Primarch-scale, transmitted his astral self through the Eldar webway, breached a conduit of the nascent Imperial webway, and appeared in astral form inside the Emperor's psychically fortified Imperial dungeon. The breach killed thousands in related psychic flashpoints across Terra, damaged the webway's structural integrity beyond repair, tore open the Emperor's carefully maintained warding, and forced the Master of Mankind off the Golden Throne project permanently, chaining him to a life support device that would sustain him in increasingly reduced capacity for 10,000 years. One Primarch's psychic output exceeded the combined defensive capacity of the Emperor's greatest strategic engineering project, built and reinforced against the entire Chaos Pantheon across decades of labor. That is the scaling ratio, not incrementally stronger than a human psyker, a categorically different order of magnitude. Applied to a null field, a human Omega-class Culexus can kill a greater demon in single combat. Sisters of Silence, operating in mass formation at Prospero, shut down an entire legion of psychers so completely that their only counter was physical attrition of the sisters themselves. A Primarch-scale null field, following the Magnus ratio, produces something the canonical record has no parallel for. Not a field that pushes demons back into the Immaterium. That's what human-scale blanks do.
Something that could operate inside the Immaterium itself, without being consumed by it, extending a null field into the warp's own domain, rather than excluding it from real space. The counter-argument that a null Primarch couldn't function as a conventional Great Crusade commander is correct and worth addressing directly. He would have killed navigators at sufficient proximity. Warp transit in his presence would have been hazardous. Astropaths and psyker-heavy legions couldn't have operated near him. Every logistical problem that a powerful blank creates, amplified to Primarch magnitude, would have made him functionally impossible to station in a conventional military role. Either he was too disruptive to use in the Great Crusade, or too useful to have been removed from it. The canonical record appears to confirm both simultaneously. He fought in the Great Crusade, his legion swelled to considerable size, and then he was gone. Those arguments assume the Null Primarch was designed for the same operational role as the other 18. The vault mechanic points toward a different specification entirely, not a commanding general for the Great Crusade, a weapon designed for a single, specific operational environment, the Immaterium itself, that the Great Crusade was creating the conditions to eventually access. The Emperor's Webway project, central to Master of Mankind by Aaron Dembski Bowden, was the plan to give humanity FTL travel without the warp, a closed webway network allowing human ships to move through the galaxy without entering the Immaterium, gradually depriving chaos of the soul energy sustaining its existence. Passive starvation, centuries long, the passive component of making chaos irrelevant. The Tzeentch entry in the fandom wiki states directly that chaos gods can't be permanently destroyed because their existence is sustained by the emotions of sentient life across the galaxy. They can be diminished, weakened, driven back. But as long as sentient beings feel ambition, grief, bloodlust, or desire for change, the chaos gods that embody those emotions persist. Passive starvation through webway adoption might eventually work. It would take centuries at minimum, and chaos would have centuries to respond. Subject 11, under the strongest forensic reading of available evidence, may have been the active component of the same strategy. Not a passive withdrawal from the warp, but a Primarch designed to enter the Immaterium itself, carrying his Null field as a vault rather than a repulsion field. A Culexus at human scale drives daemons back into the Immaterium by proximity. A Primarch-scale Null operating inside the Immaterium doesn't push them further in. There's nowhere further to go. The vault mechanic applied at Primarch-scale, in the Chaos God's own domain, holds warp entities rather than excluding them. Not permanent destruction, containment, suppression.
The removal of the Chaos God's ability to act, project, and sustain themselves from inside their own environment. No GW text states this. The argument is the analyst's strongest available conclusion from the accumulated canonical evidence. It isn't a citation from any book. What can be stated with canonical confidence about Tzeentch's role in any of this is deliberately narrow. The fandom wiki's entry on Tzeentch describes his primary operational mode. He perceives every event and intention across the galaxy, building models of probable futures from the accumulated ambitions, fears, and desires of every sentient being within it. His schemes span eons with their complexity. He moves through probability and manipulation rather than direct force. He identifies threats before they mature and converts them into instruments before they can be used. His documented heresy-era operations follow this pattern precisely. Magnus traded his eye to Tzeentch decades before the heresy, in exchange for what he genuinely believed was a cure for the Thousand Sons' flesh change mutation. He was an instrument who didn't know he was an instrument. When Magnus broke the Emperor's webway wards to deliver a warning about Horus, an act of genuine loyalty rather than corruption, he destroyed the Emperor's primary strategic project, forced the Master of Mankind onto the Golden Throne permanently, and handed Tzeentch the strategic outcome that shaped the next 10,000 years of history. The Lexicanum's entry on Magnus notes that after the burning of Prospero, the relocated Thousand Sons on the planet of sorcerers projected a sorcerous aura intended to create a permanent foothold for Tzeentch within the Immaterium. One manipulation, paying returns across millennia. No canonical source connects Tzeentch to the removal of Subject 11. The link is an inference from documented pattern and implied capability. Tzeentch perceives threats before they mature. His documented response to the Webway plan, which threatened to starve chaos passively over centuries, was an operation of decades-long complexity that used Magnus as an unwitting instrument. Subject 11. If the architecture holds, wouldn't have threatened Chaos's food supply. He would have threatened the Chaos God's ability to exist and act in their own domain. That is a categorically different and more urgent threat, and Tzeentch's response to it would have needed to predate deployment, which is what the canonical record's timeline indicates. The removal happened before the heresy. The erasure was complete before Corax was found, before Alfarius was found, before any of the events that built toward the war. The investigation into how that removal was accomplished, the operational mechanics, the instrument used, the specific sequence of events, belongs to a separate video on this channel, built around the Magnus connection. The architecture that made the removal necessary belongs here. Subject 11 wasn't removed because he had failed the Emperor. The emotional register surrounding his absence, grief where there should be condemnation, personal prohibition where there should be public judgment, separate classification where there should be erasure. indicates that something in the warp recognized what he was capable of and moved first. One thread is thinner than the others but merits a brief notation. Malal, reintroduced into 40K as the renegade entity Malice, has a sacred number of 11. The Warhammer Fantasy Fandom Wiki states it directly. Malal's sacred number is 11, and his sacred colors are white and black. The Warhammer 40K Malice Wiki confirms. Malice's sacred number is 11, and his favored colors are black and white. Malal was created by freelance designers whose intellectual property Games Workshop no longer controls, which is why he survives in current canon only as an oblique echo in the Sons of Malice warband, who use black and white heraldry and orient their doctrine around the number 11. The original design concept was an entity that consumed and destroyed other chaos entities from within the chaos pantheon, something positioned in opposition to the system it ostensibly served. Its sacred number was 11. In False Gods, the chaos-orchestrated vision shows Horus stopping at that 11 and reacting with grief and destructive rage.
The conceptual alignment is real regardless. An anti-chaos force positioned from inside the chaos system against the system itself. A renegade entity whose sacred number matches the Primarch, whose design specification suggests exactly that capacity and function. Whether Games Workshop intended this alignment is unanswerable. It exists as structural resonance in the architecture of the lore. Spear was destroyed on Dagonet, approximately 2 standard years after the drop site massacre on Istvan V. Malkador's Imperial execution force located him there, alongside the document containing the blood sample he needed to synchronize his assassination attunement. The confrontation ended the mission. The architecture that had produced him, the demon in a vault, the null field as cage rather than canceller, was abandoned with the operation. Horus learned of it afterward and removed Erebus's face with an athame as punishment for overstepping. The experiment was over.
Erebus never returned to that architecture. He never needed to, because his goal was the assassination, and the assassination had failed. He didn't understand what the ritual had demonstrated beyond this specific configuration produced a capable weapon. The deeper mechanical implication, that a null field in absorption mode could contain a warp entity and prevent its escape indefinitely, wasn't a question Erebus was asking. He was asking whether he could build an assassin capable of killing the Emperor. The answer was almost. And almost was enough to get his face flayed off. The Emperor had the same architecture, built at Primarch-scale, built before the Heresy, before the Great Crusade's end, before Erebus was anything more than a newly minted word-bearer learning to translate Eye of Terror revelation into ritual doctrine. Subject 11 was found in 927.im30. His chambers were built, his legion was assembled, and then, in the window before the heresy formally began, before Alpharius was even discovered, the records were erased with a completeness unprecedented in imperial history. The emperor's face filled with deep sorrow when Corax asked about him. The emperor personally forbade his remaining sons from speaking of the 2 absent brothers. His tomb, in the 9th edition Custodes Codex, is classified not as Primarch 11, but as Subject 11, a designation that separates him from the standard Primarch record. The comments section saw the impossibility first. 1 sentence, 1 like. Those things shouldn't be compatible. They were right.
The mechanics of why the impossible was possible. The vault rather than the canceller.
the absorption model rather than the exclusion model. The distinction between warp soul bonding and physical material ritual. Point back through every data point in Subject 11's redacted record toward a design specification the Emperor drew up and deployed before Erebus had any reason to think of the question. Erebus built a single assassin from the architecture. The Emperor built a Primarch. An earlier video on this channel built the structural argument for why 2 and 11 were paired by deliberate design rather than coincidence. The pair system framework that establishes their linked redaction as an intentional imperial decision rather than two separate tragedies. Another video built the case that 11 holds a position in the Primarch sequence, implying something about the 0 point of the project's original architecture.
This investigation is the mechanical foundation underneath both. The warp physics, the null mechanics, the daemon binding canon, and the one documented instance of a null daemon fusion that, by the rules of the setting, should never have been stable, and held perfectly until it was deliberately destroyed. Erebus didn't know what he had built. The Emperor did. Whatever moved first in the Immaterium to ensure Subject 11 was gone before he could be used understood it as well. That is why Subject 11 was the first casualty of the heresy rather than its final answer. Because he was the only Primarch in the production line designed to walk into the warp carrying a vault capable of holding what he found there, and whatever he could have held was precisely what couldn't be allowed to be held. The Investiary still has 2 empty plinths. Malcador still sits on a throne flanked by skulls marked with 2 numbers. The Emperor's face still fills with sorrow when the conversation turns that way.
The bolt is in. Subscribe for more lore like this.